side effects of those people who also exposed to other forces. Yes. That's fascinating, but from a layman's
Welcome, everyone. I am Anne Carew. I'm the Curatorial Officer at the RMIT Design Archives, and we've got Simone Rule over there in the corner, who's the Archives Officer, and Jenna Blythe over in that corner, who's the Collections Coordinator, and this is Marius here. Before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge the people of the Wabarong and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands we conduct the business of the university. RMIT respectfully acknowledges their ancestors and elders, past and present. RMIT also acknowledges the traditional custodians and ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia where we conduct our business. We're really delighted to welcome you all today to the RMIT Design Archives for our Rare Book Week event. And this session is on Champion Books and Backyard Press, an experimental publishing collective established in Greville Street, Paran in the late 1970s. The RDA first acquired a small archive of books, magazines and postcards relating to Backyard Press from its founder, Ted Hopkins, in 2011. And we only just moved into this building, and Marius has actually been involved with this acquisition since then. In an issue of the Journal in 2011, he published a short article on our collection, which is in this location here. Just if you're not familiar with the RMIT Design Archives, we focus on collecting records from World War II to the present day. And we are interested in Melbourne design practitioners, and our special interest is collecting archives that demonstrate the process of design. So Marius is our guest speaker. He's a lecturer in RMIT School of Design, and he's also now the custodian of another small archive relating to this publishing company, which you can see on the table from here. And he's also recently published a more extensive article on Backyard Press and Champion Books in the latest edition of the RMIT Design Archives Journal, which is on the table there, and there are copies available on the black desk. So we're delighted to have Marius here and have his insights. He began working for Champion Books not long after they were established, and is a wealth of information about this really interesting period in Melbourne publishing. The other thing I just wanted to note is that we are recording today. If anyone is concerned about that, would they please come and see me, and we'll make a note. I think that's all. So I'll hand over to Marius.
Thank you. I don't think I need that one.
Oh, great.
Is that coming through? Hello, and thank you for coming. It's really fascinating for me to be here and to see this spread out as it is. Prior to the exhibition that happened recently, I hadn't really paid much attention to this body of work that we produced back in the 70s and 80s. So it's really nice to see it come back into circulation and get an audience for it. The preparation for the exhibition really reminded me of the times, and also the huge effort that we put into making these things collectively and across a whole period of time. So here it is, and it's accompanied by some really interesting ephemera, which also sort of triggers some great memories, but also ideas about what was going on. As Anne said, I work at RMIT. I run a program called the Master of Design Futures. We do design that is all around the intangible, services, organisational change. And I was saying to my students that back in the day, I used to be a real designer, producing real things like books on real machines, like these printing presses in the publication. Today we're doing very intangible things like services. Machines are the laptop that we work with, and we do it all online. So it's really nice to be re-engaged with the non-digital. This was all analogue, of course. Everything existed before that. As a way of building context and introducing myself and my own interest in books, I just wanted to tell a tale of my background and my parents. It contains sectarian division, burning books, and football rivalry, which I'm hoping fits this audience's interests. My parents, Margaret and Bern Foley, lived in Melbourne up until the early 50s. They were very highly engaged in a whole range of different sort of social activities, particularly the Catholic social action movement. Some of you will know the name B.A. Santa Maria. He was very prominent in that. The right wing of the Catholic movement and the Labor Party. Mum and Dad also active in building, fundraising for the war effort. Prior to that, they built a really interesting sports park called Brennet Park out by Croydon, as a way of engaging athletes in producing events for which would then generate money for the war effort. So they were sort of active and very public people. They ran a haberdashery out in Croydon, doing quite well, and lived in Kalorama, sort of living the life really. Things unfortunately became a bit unstuck though, because Melbourne at the time was highly sectarian. It was Protestant versus Catholic. It was public service Catholic versus Protestant corporate. It was that sort of, and it was at that time where people really divided into those two camps. Mum and Dad were on the Catholic side. A number of things happened in their life, in their business, that really gave them cause to move out of Victoria. It was part of this sectarian sort of rivalry, if you like. They moved from Melbourne up the east coast of Australia, eventually landing in Toowoomba in Queensland. If you can imagine in the early 50s, that shift from Melbourne, which was culturally sophisticated, to Queensland, and no offence to Queenslanders, I'm one myself, very much a part of the backwater of Australian culture in that time. So Mum and Dad took with them a collection of really interesting small press first edition books, which they had collected from their colleagues and friends while they were in Melbourne. Again, some of you might know the Hawthorn Press. That was run by John Gardner, a printer and publisher of the time. He had a very extensive network of authors and artists who he'd worked with. Names that I remember from my youth are Frank Clune and Clive Turnbull, but there's a whole range of others which were published by Hawthorn. So Mum and Dad took this collection of books with them as a way of sort of reminding them where they came from, and hopefully pulling that into their new life in Toowoomba. Sadly, when they got there, they bought a house. They started to set themselves up. They employed a painter to come in and repaint the whole house. The whole new life was about to start. Unfortunately, that painter left the flame gun on and the house was burnt. Along with that, that large collection of books, rare, first edition, small press publications, largely went up. I can see the size and so what we were left with was this sort of remnant collection of tinged, fire-burnt books, which nevertheless found their way into our library and moved around with us from house to house where we moved after that. And for me, and I think this is my own psychological sort of analysis, but that burnt into my mind the idea of the book. And it became something that I was really attached to from that point on. There was a number of opportunities in Queensland, of course, to be able to take that and to develop that work, but it was also the time of Bjelke-Petersen, and the idea of culture and activity was pretty hard to generate. And so it occurred to me to come back to Melbourne to connect with the sort of sophisticated lifestyle that Mum and Dad talked about, and to see what was this environment where books could be made and sold and an economy built around this type of publishing. So I came back in the late 70s. I worked first at a place called Walker Press. Walker Press named after the character in the Phantom comics. Walker was a political printing company. It was predated the fast printers, so there was no access to really quick printing at that time. Walker had small offset presses. It worked for all of the political activist groups at the time: feminists, land rights, gay and lesbian, residential, and so on. So it produced a whole lot of material and was a really engaging place to work, because there's a constant flow of people coming in with new issues to work through and new ways of activating, etc. So the Walker Press was, like Backyard, was almost a commune collective, so people lived on the premises. It was located where 3CR is now in Smith Street. People lived there were activist groups meeting there was publishing and printing going on constantly. So really energetic and vibrant place, but again, one of those places where printing was much more of a secondary activity rather than a creative activity. At that time, I picked up a note in The Age, a little article with the heading, "Football player turns poet and publisher." And that intrigued me. And I thought, this is exactly what I'm looking for, that sort of strange connection that often happens in a place like Melbourne. So I read the article. I got in touch with Ted Hopkins, who was the football player, and let him know that I was working in printing and I was interested in what he was doing. For those of you interested in football in Melbourne, you'll know the name Ted Hopkins as the person who changed the match between Carlton and Collingwood in 1970. That was, again, one of those classic Melbourne rivalries of the Collingwood working class, Carlton more establishment. I think Malcolm Fraser was #1 ticket holder of Carlton at the time. So Ted, playing for Carlton, was both heralded by half of the city and hated by the other half. So a very interesting character in that sense of being right at that fault line in the city. Ted also shocked Melbourne by having effectively changed the nature of that grand final win for Carlton. Immediately left football, which was like a heresy at the time. He went off to do skiing, instructing, and writing poetry, which horrified the football scene. However, he was very adept at using his football prominence, his profile, as a way of getting attention for what he was doing. So Ted had moved from Yallourn, where he was living, and he brought with him a small offset press that his father, who was a dry cleaner, had been using. His father had died. Ted picked up the press and thought, this is an opportunity to start printing. So he moved that to 48 Greville Street in Paran, and incidentally, across the road was this collection of in 4 or 5 terrace houses, a collection of the up-and-coming live musicians in Melbourne. So they were playing local rock and roll, very active, constantly on the go, constantly needing promotion, but having very little money to produce it. So that connection quickly firmed up. They knew that Ted was there and could print things for them. We, by that time I'd started working, we were collecting remnant paper from the bigger, more commercial printer down the road and producing this work. So again, we're generating this sort of little community of people who are out there creatively very active in the music scene. What happened then, which was unexpected, I think, was that we started to get known as the printer for the live music scene. So venues set up, San Moritz and the Ballroom in St Kilda, a whole range of other places around Melbourne. They were populated then by people who were growing audience, and that produced yet another level of economy. And that economy then started to generate those large festivals and the large international tours that you're probably part of at some point. Bigger venues set up, international artists came in. So what happened with Backyard Press was we grew not only in the amount that we could produce, but in the size of the work. So we went from these small publication size pamphlets and things into large screen prints, and then as I was showing before, that printing machine here, which would do a 60-inch by 40-inch poster, and that would then be used as what they called 6 or 8 sheeters, so you'd have 6 of them across a billboard or 8 of them across a billboard. So really not only grow in the size of the economic side of the company, but also in the scale of the work. What we did then with Backyard was what we set out to do initially. We used the funds that we were getting through this commercial side to do the creative work that we were looking for. So Ted had a number of colleagues and friends, Gary Catalano, Sally Morrison, whose work he was pretty keen to publish, and we started there. And then we realised we could be much more adventurous and use this as an opportunity to really explore what printing was and what publishing was. So we would never have been able to do the type of work that we ended up with. I'll just get this. Without both the expertise that we built and the connections, as well as the printing facilities. So we had a large 20 by 30 inch printer, a large screen printing table, a smaller A4 size offset press. And with all of that, we started to produce work. Things that we couldn't do, we sent out to other printers who we'd already made connections with. And in that sort of small business economy, we were supporting them by giving them commercial work that we couldn't do. So there was a nice reciprocity with it. So we started with this one here. As I said, Ted came from Yallourn. For those of you who don't know, Yallourn was a state electricity commission town. It was built by the SEC. They realised at one point that there was an incredible coal seam under Yallourn, and they wanted to get to it, so they literally moved the town and replaced people in local areas. This here is the indication of the I think the power stacks that they were going to build here, and they were accessing that coal from underneath. So this was horrific, of course, from the locals, but one of those things that you can do in a company town because you own it, so you just shift it. So Ted, living there at the time, produced this work. It's a combination of report and poetry, and it was a way of sort of alerting people in Melbourne to the fact that this was going on. one of our first pieces, and we spent quite a bit of time on this, working out the way that we'd present it. So we set it up as a corporate report, simile, if you like. So that led us then to a much larger piece of work. These won't be in sequence, but I'll take you through them. The Book of Slab. So the Book of Slab, Ted, I guess, is work by Ted Hopkins. Ted is a poet of the everyday. So he picked up this idea of using ephemera, the things that we use in our everyday life, as the context for his poetry. And the book itself, while it doesn't always appear as a collection of poems, is designed in that way. So it's to be read as an extensive observation, I think, on the world, and opportunity to pay homage, in a way, to some of the ephemera and the materials that were around at the time. What interested us as well was, how do we construct this as a book? So rather than just print it and publish it, what are the things that we could bring to it that were unique, or talked really about the material of printing, paper, ink, type, image, and so on. So it was a construction, a compilation, an assemblage, as much as it was the content of the work. I'm just trying to look for, not coming up in this one. As an example, one of the inserts into the book was not appearing here. I'll let you have a look at that anyway. A small single, vinyl single called Slab Goes Italiano, which was a literally recorded piece of music which was inserted in here for people to play. So I think I've got a nice quote here that talks about it. This is from Judith Hothberg from the Quarterly Review of Books by Artists in America. This limited edition bookwork is an ambitious undertaking that is a multimedia performance. It defies any ordinary definition of bookwork, artist book, or even book experience. It is a different experience created by a poet, printer, typographical master, artist, universal seeker, which I think really sums it up nicely. And it grabbed our intention of producing this other thing. Then we move to this work by Peter Lysiotis, and some of you might know Peter's work. Peter is a photo montagist, did some really fascinating work in the style of John Hartfield, who was a European photo montagist from the wartime. Peter was a migrant. I think his parents came out with him early in his life. He had a migrant experience of Melbourne, which again is one of those really sort of unique intersections or interfaces with culture. He, while very strongly multicultural, was also interested in that experience from a critical perspective. So not just accepting it as a nice to have, he was sort of looking at it from the perspective of the person who actually goes through it. So he brought this photo montage project into the Champion books. The way we worked in Champion, because we were voluntary, was that if you had a project that you wanted to work on, you actually had to drive it. So yes, we'd work and collaborate on the printing side, but you had to do a lot of that work of either finding money or working out with us on the design and so forth. So this was a really interesting project. Journey of a Wise Electron. I'll just read this piece, which I quite like as a descriptor of what Peter was doing. That's Peter. Peter is still an active bookmaker. To my parents, who taught me how to watch and how to adjust, which is a really nice, neat way of sort of looking at this very slim experience of the television experience at the time. Peter brought this in. We decided that the way to treat this work, which was collage and from source material, was to give it a sense of quality. And we noticed that the tonal ranges were really quite challenging to work with. You have this really dark end of the range and these very subtle colours, subtle greys as well. So we discovered this process, which other printers knew about, called the duotone. And literally it's two plates to achieve the one piece of work. So one plate will give you your dark end and the other plate will give you your lighter tones. So you get that full range, which was challenging but really satisfying for us to work through that process. We were really lucky at the time to be sharing the premises with a person who was a master plate maker, whose job was making film. If you know the offset process, it's a piece of film which is exposed with the imagery and the type. It's laid on a plate which has an emulsion on it. That plate is then washed, and where the emulsion is where the ink takes and then offsets onto the paper. This person, whose name I forget, was such a master that he could actually do what was called dot etching. So in the film stage, you would have a piece of film with a gradated dot, which was allowed the ink to break into those tones. And he would reduce that size of the dot by simply rubbing etching over it and then stop when he found that it was at the right point. So if you imagine these dots, they're minuscule. And that level of expertise, of course, doesn't exist anymore. But it was something that he brought to it. So again, it was a collaboration of experts in the trade as well as people who were interested in the creative art side of it. So the duotones were extremely challenging. I think from the little bit of research that I found about it, we didn't document much of this, of course, 72 plates were made, so 2 plates per colour, and there was a lot of wastage because you couldn't use it unless it was working properly. So that's a really interesting one to have a look at. What would have been a massive cost was something that we were able to do, both with trading off these skills and working with our own ability to work on that. And then, I'm not sure how this time's going. Well, let me get back to it. No, yeah, cool. Good idea. This one here, thanks. This one here is by an artist, contemporary artist who's still working, Paul Green. And this was a fast piece, I guess. It was something that we thought, let's see if we can turn it out. These larger pieces, of course, they would go over 18 months or 2 years because there was a huge amount of work and production involved. But this one was something that we wanted to do quite quickly, both in terms of getting it out, but also to honour the immediacy of the imagery that's in there. My favourite of which is, I think it's at the start, the rabbit and the turtle with the caption, it was a great day for the start of a fable, which was sort of indicative, I think, of our sort of approach to these types of works. We were out there to create this fable. So Paul is a painter, but as you can see from this work, really interesting in the concepts and how they're presented. We grabbed this little image here of the tree in the wire guard as the branding for Champion Books. Again, that sort of idea of the everyday elevated into something like a logo. The quote about Paul's work, a collection of drawings and words which gives a unique perspective on the business of creation and some of its more sordid activities, including war and heroes, tourists and invaders, somewhat full of cynicism, sarcasm and comedy. Paul is practicing artist and now living in Albury. Then we move on to this one. I'll grab... thanks. Another work by Ted Hopkins. I should say Ted's still alive, but sadly has dementia, so otherwise he would have been here. He would love to talk to you about his work, but that's not possible, so hopefully I'm doing it credit. This book, again, sort of talks to the idea of the poetry of the everyday. This is a teledex simulation. You may remember the teledex as a little device that sat by the landline, an index of phone numbers and contacts. You'd dial that up or down, pick that, press a button, it would come up at that tabbed index page. That wasn't quite possible to achieve, but we did this simulation. So again, taking the idea of the book and putting it into a totally different format, but sort of evoking the idea of the everyday as well. So these poems by Ted are in alphabetical order, so you can dial up your poem depending on the letter of the alphabet that you're most interested in at the time. Along with producing this piece of work, the intention was to sell it as a subscription. So you would actually subscribe to the book with the idea that every now and again a new alphabetical index page would be sent to you. From memory, we didn't go to that point. I don't think anyone subscribed, but it was again saying, what is it about the book? What's the interface with the book and its reader? And where can we interrupt that and change it for some effect? So again, that's a really interesting one to look at. I guess it's quite heavy. One of the things that we noticed there when we were producing it, we were sending it out to be collated. We got a call from the person who was in the bindery company saying, sorry, we can't do this. There's a foul word on one of the pages and the women collators are not prepared to work on it. So we had to find yet another workaround to that little instance. So again, that sort of idea of pushing the book into a different space and looking to see what it does. How do people respond to that? And then I might conclude with this one, art and a texter. So at the time, in the 80s, mid-80s, a local art critic, Paul Taylor, was producing a publication called Art and Text. Art and Text we actually printed. Art and Text was a highly intellectual critique of local and international art, very well respected by people in the area, but it took a very strong postmodernist perspective. Again, one of these sort of fault lines started to open up between the modernists and the postmodernists. Probably in Backyard we had a representative from both sides. People like Ted and others were very much on the modernist side, saw it as a bit sort of arrogant in its pretense to be writing about art in a particularly abstract way, theoretical way. Others within the collective were seeing it as a really interesting intervention into the Melbourne art scene, that postmodernism, the intellectualism, the theories, etc. After a number of us had left, Ted and others produced this work called Art and a Texter. So it was a parody on art and text. Its intention was to take it down and to be playful, I guess, to be fair with it. Interestingly, Paul Taylor was the sort of person who didn't take that lightly. So Paul took them to court on the idea that this was passing off, in other words, being sold as the actual art and text. So they went to court. He didn't win, but there was a general settlement that it wouldn't be sold. So again, I guess on that fault line, I'll end where I started with this sort of idea of division and intersections and connections within Melbourne. And in a way, celebrating the fact that a city like Melbourne could allow these sort of things to happen and a general market to exist for them. Yeah, thank you.